Somewhere in the strait between Taiwan and the Philippines, on a cluster of islands so small and so remote that modern aircraft still get grounded there for days at a time during typhoon season, researchers went looking for something simple, the closest living genetic echo of the population that started one of the largest human migrations in history. What they actually found was stranger and more layered than a clean answer. Not a single population standing untouched since the beginning, but a population that was settled, then apparently abandoned, then resettled by a completely different wave of the same broader migration. 1,000 years later, leaving behind a genetic signature that still puzzles the researchers who study it today. To understand why that answer matters and why it's actually more interesting than a simple, tidy, one population survived intact story, you have to start with the scale of what these researchers were working with in the first place. The Philippines is made up of more than 7,000 islands, roughly 3,000 of them inhabited, spread across a stretch of ocean most people underestimate, from the mountainous north near Taiwan down to the coral-fringed south near Borneo and Indonesia. Genetic surveys sampling across that entire range have to account for enormous internal diversity. Dozens of distinct ethno-linguistic groups, each carrying its own specific history of contact, isolation, and migration. When researchers began comparing DNA collected across this full geographic spread, the goal wasn't simply to describe modern Filipino ancestry in broad strokes. It was to trace exactly how, and in what order, the different ancestral layers actually arrived, island by island, region by region, and to figure out which populations, if any, still carried something close to the original genetic signal from the very beginning of the story. To understand what they found, you have to go back roughly 4,000 to 6,000 years, to the start of one of the largest and fastest human migrations ever documented. Sometime between 3,000 and 6,000 BCE, seafaring populations speaking languages belonging to what linguists call the Austronesian family began moving south out of Taiwan, carrying with them outrigger canoe technology, domesticated animals, and root crop agriculture, considerably more advanced than anything already established further south. This expansion is one of the most remarkable in the historical record, not because of its violence or scale of conquest, but because of its sheer geographic reach. Within a few thousand years, descendants of that same original Taiwanese population had reached Madagascar off the coast of Africa in one direction, and Easter Island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in the other, a linguistic and genetic footprint spanning more than half the planet's circumference, carried not by armies, but by small groups of skilled sailors, island-hopping across open ocean using navigational techniques that wouldn't be matched in Europe for thousands of years. Reading star patterns, wave formations, and bird flight paths to cross stretches of open water that would remain genuinely dangerous even for much later, far better equipped European explorers. Archaeologists tracking this expansion rely heavily on a distinctive style of red-slipped pottery that shows up consistently at sites tracing the exact route this migration took, moving from Taiwan through the northern Philippines, onward through the rest of the archipelago, and eventually out across the wider Pacific world, a physical archaeological trail that matches closely with what linguists had already reconstructed by comparing Austronesian languages against each other. The Philippines sat directly in the path of that expansion, the very first major landmass south of Taiwan these seafaring populations would have encountered. Which raises the obvious question researchers wanted a precise answer to: if the entire Austronesian world traces back to that single founding population in Taiwan, where in the Philippines, does that founding signal survive most clearly, closest to the original source, before it started blending with everything else already present, or that arrived afterward? The place researchers kept returning to is the Batanes Islands, a small remote archipelago sitting at the very northern tip of the Philippines, closer to Taiwan than to Manila. separated from the Taiwanese coast by a channel of open water that, on a clear day, sailors can cross using nothing more sophisticated than the same basic outrigger technology that carried the original Austronesian expansion south in the first place. The people of Batanes are known as the Ivatan, and linguistically their connection to Taiwan was already strongly suspected long before any genetic data came back. The Botanic language group, which includes Ivatan and the related Itbayat and Babuyan languages, sits at the very root of the Malayo-Polynesian branch of Austronesian, the branch that eventually spread across the rest of the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and out into the wider Pacific. Comparative linguists reconstructing the Austronesian family tree identified Botanic as one of the earliest and most conservative branches to split off from the original Taiwanese source, preserving grammatical features and vocabulary that had already been lost, simplified, or transformed almost everywhere else the expansion eventually reached. The genetic story, though, turned out to be considerably more complicated than a simple, unbroken line running from ancient Taiwan straight down to the Ivatan living in Batanes today. A landmark 2011 genetic study comparing the Yami, an Austronesian population living on Taiwan's Orchid Island, against the Ivatan of Batanes, found something researchers didn't fully expect going in. Rather than showing Batanes as a direct, continuously inhabited extension of the original Taiwanese source population, the evidence pointed to something closer to two separate settlement events. The Batanes Islands appear to have first been used as a stepping stone during the earliest phase of the Austronesian expansion out of Taiwan, roughly 5,000 years ago. But the genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that the original settlement did not simply continue uninterrupted. Instead, the islands were apparently repopulated by a separate wave of Austronesian-descended settlers arriving from northern Luzon, in the Philippines itself, roughly 3,000 years later, and it's this second wave that became the direct ancestors of the Ivatan population living in Batanes today. That detail matters enormously because it means the genetic affinity researchers actually measured between modern Ivatan and modern Taiwanese populations turned out to be, in some analyses, weaker than the affinity between Ivatan and other Philippine populations, particularly those in northern Luzon, the exact opposite of what a simple, unbroken preservation story would predict. A separate earlier study examining HLA markers, a different type of genetic marker tied to immune system function, had found real similarities between Ivatan and specific Taiwanese groups including the Yami and Puyuma. So the underlying connection to Taiwan is genuine and well documented. But the fuller genetic picture, once researchers dug into mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome data more closely, points toward a population history considerably more layered than one isolated group sat still for 5,000 years, while everyone else mixed. What actually seems to have happened, based on the current evidence, is a genuine and repeated back and forth across that narrow channel of water separating Taiwan and the northern Philippines, rather than a single migration in one direction that then simply froze in place. Later research has even suggested the reverse pattern occurred as well, that the Tao people living on Taiwan's Orchid Island today may themselves represent a later reverse migration back north from Batanes, rather than a purely one-way population flow moving only southward. Genetic surveys describe this as a bidirectional migration pattern within the broader Austronesian dispersal, sailors moving back and forth across that channel repeatedly over centuries rather than a single decisive journey in one direction. This is genuinely a more interesting finding than a clean, static story would have been, because it reveals something real about how these populations actually lived. The waters between Taiwan and the northern Philippines weren't a one-time crossing point that got used once and then abandoned. They functioned for a very long stretch of history as an active, ongoing maritime corridor with people language, and genes, moving back and forth across it repeatedly, long after the initial Austronesian expansion had already pushed on to more distant parts of the Pacific. None of this diminishes how remote and comparatively isolated Batanes remained relative to the rest of the Philippines, though, and that isolation is still central to why the islands matter so much to researchers studying this broader migration. The Batanes Islands sit exposed to frequent dangerous typhoons that make sea travel genuinely hazardous for large stretches of the year, difficult to reach by sea even with modern boats, let alone the vessels available to later waves of traders and colonizers moving through the rest of the archipelago over the following centuries. The islands have no natural deep-water harbor capable of easily accommodating large trading ships, and their position at the very northern edge of the country, hundreds of kilometers from Manila and the main centers of Spanish colonial administration, meant that colonial authorities largely left the islands to govern themselves for long stretches of the colonial period, a level of practical autonomy few other parts of the archipelago experienced to anywhere near the same degree. That relative isolation appears to have shielded Batanes from the kind of intense, repeated, large-scale admixture that reshaped genetic profiles across most of the rest of the Philippines over the following several thousand years, even if the island's own specific population history turned out to include its own internal disruption and resettlement partway through that story. Because almost everywhere else in the archipelago, that later admixture was extensive, and understanding it is what makes the broader Philippine genetic picture so layered in the first place. Long before the Austronesian migration ever reached the Philippines, the islands were already home to an earlier population, commonly grouped today under the term Negrito, including the Ayta, Agta, and Ati peoples descended from some of the very first modern humans to reach maritime Southeast Asia at all, likely tens of thousands of years before the first Austronesian outrigger canoe ever touched Philippine shores, part of an extremely ancient coastal migration route that also produced related populations as far away as the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal. When the Austronesian migrants arrived several thousand years later, they didn't simply replace this existing population. Across most of the archipelago, the two groups mixed extensively over many centuries in proportions that vary dramatically from island to island and community to community, depending on local history, geography, and how thoroughly each specific region eventually absorbed the incoming farming population. Some communities today carry only a faint trace of that older pre-Austronesian ancestry, diluted after thousands of years of intermarriage with the numerically much larger Austronesian descended population. Others, particularly specific Negrito communities that remained more isolated in interior mountain regions, protected by terrain that made large-scale intermarriage with lowland populations genuinely difficult for centuries, carry considerably more of it, including, as separate published research has shown, some of the highest concentrations of Denisovan ancestry, DNA, inherited from an extinct archaic human species, known mainly from a handful of fossil fragments discovered in a Siberian cave found anywhere on the planet, higher even than populations in Papua New Guinea and Melanesia, long assumed to hold that particular record. Layer on top of that centuries of additional contact that most of the Philippines experienced far more intensely than the Batanes Islands ever did. Long before European contact, the archipelago sat along active maritime trade networks connecting South Asia, China, and the wider Pacific world. Chinese trading communities settled in parts of the archipelago across multiple historical waves, leaving a measurable genetic contribution concentrated mostly in and around major historical port cities. South Asian merchant contact, part of a much larger Indianized trading world that once connected South Asia to Southeast Asia through commerce and religion rather than conquest, added another distinct thread into specific coastal populations. Then, starting in 1521, when Ferdinand Magellan's expedition first reached the archipelago, everything changed on a scale nothing before it had matched. Spanish colonization of the Philippines lasted more than 3 centuries, formally beginning with permanent settlement in 1565 and lasting until 1898, one of the longest single periods of European colonial rule anywhere in Asia. And it left a measurable permanent genetic mark concentrated most heavily in Manila and other major population centers where colonial administration, trade, and intermarriage were most intensely concentrated across those 300-plus years. Compounding that European genetic contribution further was the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, a continuous shipping route connecting the Philippines directly to Spanish colonial Mexico for 2.5 centuries, running from 1565 to 1815, carrying not just silver and silk back and forth across the Pacific in what was, at the time, one of the longest sustained trade routes anywhere on Earth, but people too, sailors, merchants, and settlers, moving in both directions, adding a measurable Latin American genetic thread into specific Filipino communities, particularly those connected to Manila's colonial trade economy and the ports that served the galleon fleet directly. American colonization in the early 20th century, following the Spanish-American War and lasting until Philippine independence in 1946, followed by continued waves of Chinese immigration that never fully stopped across the following century, predating Spanish arrival by centuries and continuing steadily ever since, added still more layers on top of everything that came before, each new arrival contributing its own small, measurable, genetically detectable addition to an already extraordinarily layered national genetic picture built up over thousands of years of accumulated contact. Put all of that together, and you get the actual shape of the comparison researchers were making across the archipelago. Across most of the roughly 3,000 inhabited islands making up the Philippines, modern Filipino DNA reflects this entire accumulated history, a deep Negrito genetic foundation, layered with the original Austronesian migration from Taiwan, layered further with centuries of South Asian and Chinese trade contact, and layered finally with over 300 years of Spanish colonial admixture, a Pacific genetic bridge to Mexico, and a 20th century American contribution on top of all of it. Every one of those layers is real, genuinely detectable in the genome, and genuinely part of the country's documented history. Batanes stands apart from most of that layering, not because its population sat perfectly frozen since the very beginning of the Austronesian story, but because its specific, more localized history of settlement, apparent abandonment, and resettlement from northern Luzon left it considerably less exposed to the intense, repeated waves of outside contact that reshaped major port populations and colonial centers everywhere else in the archipelago. Sitting outside the main colonial trade routes, too remote and too difficult to reach for large-scale Spanish settlement, too isolated for the same intensity of Chinese trade contact that reshaped populations elsewhere, the Ivatan population preserved something considerably closer to an early, relatively unmixed slice of Austronesian ancestry than almost anywhere else in the country, even if the specific population living there today descends more directly from that later Luzon origin resettlement than from an unbroken line stretching all the way back to the very first Taiwanese sailors who passed through 5,000 years ago. That's the genuine, more honest version of only one population matched that the actual research supports. It's not that Batanes is simply older or that its people are somehow more authentically Filipino than anyone else living across the archipelago's other 3,000 islands. A framing researchers studying this topic have been careful to explicitly reject. It's that Batanes functions, largely by geographic accident, as a kind of partial genetic time capsule, preserving a version of relatively early, comparatively unmixed Austronesian ancestry, layered with its own specific and genuinely fascinating local history of resettlement. that the rest of the Philippines simply absorbed and transformed far more extensively through thousands of years of additional outside contact that Batanes itself was largely spared from experiencing at the same intensity. There's a broader scientific value in this too, one that goes well beyond simple national curiosity. Populations like the Ivatan, sitting closer to a deep ancestral Austronesian signal than almost anywhere else descended from the same original migration, function as genuinely valuable reference points for researchers trying to reconstruct the full Austronesian expansion in detail, tracing exactly how and in what order and in which direction populations spread and moved back and forth between Taiwan and the Philippines, and eventually into Indonesia, Malaysia, and the wider Pacific over the following several thousand years. Comparing more heavily admixed populations elsewhere in the Philippines against a population like the Ivatan, sitting closer to that original genetic baseline, gives researchers a clearer picture of exactly how much additional ancestry, and from which specific sources, other Filipino communities picked up along the way, providing something close to a natural control group against which every other population's admixture history can be measured with far greater precision than would otherwise be possible. This kind of research carries real weight beyond pure historical interest as well. Understanding the specific genetic makeup of relatively isolated reference populations like the Ivatan helps researchers studying human migration more broadly calibrate their models for how quickly and how thoroughly genetic admixture typically occurs once previously separated populations come into sustained contact, and how often migrations that look at first glance like a single one-way journey actually turn out, on closer genetic inspection, to involve multiple waves moving in both directions over a much longer stretch of time than researchers originally assumed. Research with applications reaching well beyond the Philippines into how geneticists reconstruct ancient migrations everywhere, from the Pacific Islands to the Americas, to the deepest reaches of prehistoric Eurasia. None of this diminishes what the rest of the Philippines actually is, genetically or culturally. A country built from this many layers, this many distinct waves of contact and migration, arguably tells a richer, more genuinely interesting story than a population that simply stayed put and never mixed with anyone at all. Manila's genetic complexity, reflecting centuries of trade, colonization, and migration converging on a single major port city, home today to one of the densest, most ethnically layered urban populations anywhere in Southeast Asia, is its own remarkable historical record, just as legitimate and just as worth understanding as the more localized, comparatively unmixed ancestry preserved up in Batanes. Mindanao's own distinct layering, shaped by centuries of separate trade, contact with the Islamic sultanates of maritime Southeast Asia, tells a different, equally significant story again. These are simply different kinds of genetic stories, shaped by different degrees of geographic isolation, different centuries of contact, different specific historical pressures, both equally real, both equally part of what the modern Philippines actually is at the genetic level, once you actually look closely enough to read it properly. What the comparison across all 3,000 islands ultimately reveals is a country built in layers, most of it extensively blended by thousands of years of trade, migration, and colonization, with one small remote cluster of islands sitting just off to the side of most of that later layering, holding on to a version of the story that turns out to be more complicated and in some ways more genuinely interesting than a simple, unbroken preservation narrative would have been. The Ivatan didn't set out to become a genetic reference point for reconstructing one of history's largest human migrations. Geography and a specific, still only partially understood local history of settlement and resettlement simply left them in a position where the intense, repeated waves of outside contact that reshaped most of the rest of the archipelago moved past them far more gently, even as their own islands quietly changed hands, genetically speaking, at least once along the way. There's something worth sitting with in that fact. Batanes today is one of the least visited, least discussed provinces in the entire Philippines, often overshadowed in the national conversation by Manila, Cebu, or the more heavily touristed islands further south. Its population, numbering only in the tens of thousands, represents a tiny fraction of the roughly 110 million people living across the country today. And yet, genetically and linguistically, this small, wind-battered cluster of islands holds something the rest of the nation's more populous, more historically prominent regions simply don't. A direct, still debated, but genuinely real thread reaching back toward the very beginning of the Austronesian story, complicated by its own internal twist of abandonment and resettlement. Thousands of years before anyone had a word for Philippines or Manila or any of the empires and nations that would eventually claim these islands as their own. None of this makes Batanes more authentically Filipino than Manila or Cebu or Mindanao, and researchers studying this topic have been careful to say so directly. Filipino identity was never built on genetic uniformity in the first place, any more than any other modern national identity was. What the DNA actually reveals is a more complete, more precisely dated, and considerably more complicated version of a story every Filipino community carries in some form, where the original threads came from, how far they traveled, how often they doubled back on themselves, and, in one remarkable and still actively studied case, just how much of that early signal managed to survive at all, even after its own quiet, largely forgotten chapter of disruption partway through.